The rangers warned them not to enter the deep woods after dark, but they didn't say why. Tonight, Dreadscribe writes again. Before we begin, don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling stories. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, and if there's a story you'd like me to cover next, I'd love to hear it too. The first night in the forest felt like stepping into another world, a world older, darker, and somehow sentient. The pines rose like cathedral pillars, their spindly tops swaying against a moon veiled by mist. My campfire crackled faintly, a lone ember of warmth surrounded by an ocean of cold shadows. I had chosen this remote spot deliberately, miles from the nearest trail, chasing solitude like an addict seeking silence. But as night deepened, that silence became oppressive. It pressed against my ears until even the faintest sound, a snapping twig, a shifting breeze, seemed amplified, like whispers echoing through the hollows of my mind. At first, I told myself the noises were just wind threading through the branches. The forest, after all, had its own language. But as I lay in my tent, the sound began to take shape, fragments of syllables weaving together into something unsettlingly human. It was soft at first, like someone speaking from beneath water. Then clearer, my name drawn out into a breath that felt intimate and wrong. My blood went cold. I unzipped the tent and scanned the dark tree line, my flashlight slicing through mist. Nothing moved, only the endless pines, their trunks standing rigid like silent sentinels. I stayed awake until dawn, mind buzzing with rationalizations. Fatigue, auditory hallucinations, maybe even the effects of isolation. Science could explain a lot of strange phenomena, I reminded myself. The human brain is a storyteller, crafting meaning from chaos. Yet a part of me, the primal ancient part, knew I hadn't imagined it. There had been intent in that voice, as deliberate as a finger tracing my spine. The next day, I ventured deeper into the woods, hoping to confront my fear through exploration. The forest seemed almost too quiet now, like a crowd holding its breath. I followed a dry creek bed until I stumbled upon something unexpected, a weathered structure half swallowed by vines. It was an old ranger station, its roof sagging under years of neglect. The windows were broken, and the wooden door hung ajar, groaning as I pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and the sharp tang of rust. Sunlight filtered through broken slats, casting fractured beams across overturned furniture and yellowed maps. On a desk lay a journal, its pages warped from dampness. I flipped through it and froze. Each entry documented missing hikers, their names scrawled hastily alongside last known locations. But as the entries progressed, the handwriting grew frantic, words blurring into near madness. One phrase repeated over and over, "The forest speaks. It remembers." A chill spread through me as I read the final page. The last entry wasn't about a missing hiker. It was about a voice, a whispering chorus that grew louder each night until the writer claimed they could no longer think clearly. The final line ended mid-sentence, as though the writer had been interrupted. As I stood there, the forest outside seemed to inhale. Then came the whispers again, closer this time, urgent and many. And woven between them, unmistakable and sharp, was my own name. My breath caught as the voices fell silent, replaced by a single guttural sound that didn't belong to anything human. The growl tore through the station like a rip in cloth, low and wet, vibrating the cracked panes and the cartilage in my ribs. Instinct told me to run. Curiosity nailed me in place. When the sound came again, I felt it first, a sub-bass flutter that made the walls breathe. I thumbed through the journal and found a map sketched into the margins, a narrow route veering off every chart I knew toward a hand-drawn circle. Beside it, the note, "Listening ground, not wind." The letters leaned forward, urgent. I reached for science like a rope, telling myself the whispers were infrasound, resonance braided between trunks, a forest-turned instrument. Yet the pattern felt intentional, counted like breath, as though something timed me between heartbeats. Outside, the pines waited like a congregation, each trunk a candle without a flame. I followed the map's ghost trail across the dry creek and into a glade sealed with mist. The growl receded, then returned from another angle, circling. Once my name rose from nowhere, softer than a moth's wing against glass. I didn't answer. The trail ended at a ring of ancient stumps, their centers black as if lightning had stitched them together. I knelt and pressed my ear to the soil. Whispers surged up like air through a reed, 1,000 threads murmuring underfoot. I pictured the mycorrhizal web, fungal filaments trading sugars and signals between trees, a living telegraph. If roots can pass warnings, can wind become words? The thought opened like a trapdoor beneath my skepticism and dropped me a level deeper. I stood and said my name aloud, steady and small. The forest answered with stillness. Silence can be ceremonial, like a congregation bowing its head. It can also be a blade. The stillness didn't break. It hardened into attention, the kind that waits for a confession. 4 gouges raked one trunk high as my shoulder, sap beating like tears. Fear cinched tight, but I kept my voice level and my feet planted. Then my boot clicked on metal. Pine needles hit a square hatch sunk flush with the ground. I cleared the debris, found a rust-slick handle and tugged until it yielded with a long, reluctant breath. A ladder fell into a throat of shadow. The journal's last line burned in my mind. The ranger had stopped mid-sentence, not mid-thought. Perhaps the rest lived down there, beside the growl that knew my name. Rung by rung I descended, counting numbers like prayers. The hatch thudded closed above me, not from wind. An amber glow budded along the tunnel, neither electric nor fire, more like resin remembering light. The whispers knit into a single deliberate phrase that wore my voice like a borrowed coat. Something moved in reply, close enough to stir the air. I took 1 step forward. Down there, something took 1 step too. I steadied my breathing, lifted my hand into the glow, and listened for the shape of its reply. Was it echo, animal, or forest itself rehearsing a language it wanted me to learn? The morning began with a brittle kind of silence, the kind that feels deliberately placed rather than accidental. Dew clung to every blade of grass around my tent, sparkling like tiny stars that had fallen overnight. I was stirring the embers of last night's fire when I noticed the first track. It was long, too long and strangely narrow, pressed deeply into the wet earth. At first glance, it looked vaguely human, but the arch was unnaturally stretched, the toes too sharp, as if whatever had made it hadn't decided whether to walk upright or crawl. A second print appeared a few feet away, then another, forming a winding trail that snaked between the trees. I crouched to examine them more closely, tracing the edges with my fingertips. The depth suggested something heavy, far heavier than a deer or bear, yet the stride was uneven, almost hesitant. My rational mind grasped at easy answers: erosion, overlapping animal prints, maybe even a prank by another camper. But I hadn't seen a single soul for miles, and the forest around me felt untouched, as if it had been holding its breath for decades. The prints seemed deliberate, like an invitation or a warning. Compelled by a mix of dread and curiosity, I packed my gear and began to follow the tracks. The woods grew denser as I walked, branches knitting overhead until sunlight fractured into pale, trembling beams. Each step felt like peeling back a curtain, revealing a stage where I wasn't supposed to be. The tracks twisted through gullies and over ridges, sometimes veering into shallow streams before re-emerging on the other side. It was as if the creature knew it was being followed and was testing my resolve. Half a mile in, I began to notice something unsettling. The surrounding wildlife had vanished. No birdsong, no rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. Even the insects were silent, as though life itself had recoiled from this path. A heavy unease settled over me, pressing on my chest like the weight of an unseen hand. I thought of the human need to map and name things, to bring chaos into order, but this trail defied naming. It was like a sentence written in a forgotten language, one I was never meant to read. The deeper I went, the more erratic the prints became. Some appeared pressed sideways into tree trunks, as if the creature had clung there like a predator waiting to strike. Others were spaced impossibly far apart, suggesting leaps no earthly body could manage. Sweat slicked my palms despite the chill in the air. Every rational explanation frayed at the edges, leaving only the raw animal knowledge that something was terribly wrong. Then, without warning, the tracks stopped. They didn't fade gradually or lead into a thicket. They simply ended in the middle of a barren clearing. The earth beyond was smooth and undisturbed, like a page wiped clean. I spun slowly, scanning for signs of struggle or disturbance, but there was nothing. It was as if the creature had been erased, plucked from reality mid-step. As I stood there, Bewildered and breathless, a new sensation crawled over me. The tiny hairs on my neck lifted, a primal alarm bell ringing deep within. Slowly, I tilted my head upward. Above the clearing, the canopy swayed gently, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something move. A shadow detached from the branches, held its breath with me, with the needles trembling as if a giant lung had paused between beats. A shape clung to the upper branches where the light thinned into slate. Too long for a cat, too articulate for an owl, wrong in the quiet way that turns instinct into a siren. I eased one boot back as though the clearing were thin ice. Resin sweetened the air. A strand of lichen lifted despite the windless hush, displaced by something I couldn't see, like a ripple running beneath black glass. I kept my gaze up, afraid that looking away would teach it courage. I marked the clearing's edge with a stick and lifted my camera, zooming into a braid of twigs. The pixels surrendered only grain and shadow, but the bark at my back told a cleaner story. Long, parallel scrapes stair-stepped up the trunk at impossible intervals, tally marks in a prison no human would design. Sap had dried into glassy beads that caught stray light like little planets. If tracks could climb, these were constellations. But what I didn't expect was the spacing. Each rake suggested a reach wider than my outstretched arms, as if gravity were optional. I touched one groove through my glove. The ridges under my fingertips raised like old scar tissue. Biomechanics flickered through my mind. Lever arms, tendon recoil, elastic energy stored and released like a bow holding breath before it sings. Whatever moved here spent gravity like a negotiable fee. A hair snagged beneath a sliver of bark gleamed translucent, finer than fishing line, not mammal and not synthetic. Beneath it, the lichen had died in a tight spiral, a fingerprint burned in green. The forest was writing, and I was still learning its alphabet. But what alphabet arranges letters in the trees? Curiosity tipped the scale by a single grain. I looped paracord over a low limb and hoisted myself. Soles scraping, breath counting holds like a climber in confession. Above the clearing, the world became a second forest, beams and platforms of intersecting boughs. Every needle felt tuned, and somewhere higher a faint clicking kept time, a metronome measuring my doubt. Fear moved through me like cold smoke. I let it pass without loosening my grip. The higher I climbed, the more the branches healed the absence on the ground, as if the trail had simply inverted. How many hikers had followed a sentence written upward? 10 feet up, a pad print stamped into velvet moss stopped me. Oval and ridged, faintly iridescent, it looked like a cluster of petals mid-collapse. The impression shimmered with a slick that smelled metallic, rain on iron. Nearby, a length of orange survey tape fluttered from a knot, initials in faded marker. A year tied to a season when 3 hikers vanished along this ridge. Loss didn't arrive as memory. It arrived as pressure, like altitude. I imagined them here, heads tilted like mine, listening for an answer the ground couldn't provide. Awe and anger braided together, tight as rope. Following a run of bent twigs, I reached a natural corridor and froze. The branch ahead bowed under weight that wasn't there, like a tightrope just vacated. The forest carried momentum the way a city carries rumor. I dusted fine ash from my pocket, a trick from tracking courses, and released it. Suspended in still air, the ash drifted, then swerved sharply, sketching the contour of an invisible body as it moved past my shoulder. My skin prickled the way metal sings before a storm, but what it didn't expect was my refusal to descend. A drop struck my wrist, cold as spring water. It left a pale smear that tingled, the skin humming like plucked wire. I looked up into the lattice where shadow braided with shadow and caught a shape uncoiling. Thinner than a man, longer than a deer, articulating along the branch like punctuation crawling across a line. The clicking stopped. A soft pressure gathered behind me on the trunk, deliberate and close. I didn't turn. The clearing below felt suddenly far, color leaching from memory like ink in rain. Then, from somewhere above the leaves, something inhaled, and the entire canopy seemed to lean closer, as if waiting to hear my name again. Dusk has a way of softening the forest, turning sharp edges into whispers and familiar trails into something almost holy. I was miles from the nearest town, following a narrow ridge that overlooked a valley swimming in mist. The last light of day painted the treetops gold, but beneath the canopy, night was already gathering, pooling in the hollows like dark water. I was planning to set up camp soon when a glow caught my eye. a pale, flickering light threading through the pines ahead. It was too warm to be a star and too steady to be a firefly. At first, relief bloomed in me. It had to be another hiker, maybe someone who had lost their way. The light swayed gently, as if cradled in a hand. I cupped my hands and shouted, my voice bouncing between the trees, but no reply came. Instead, the glow shifted slightly, like it had heard me and was considering whether to retreat or advance. My stomach tightened, yet my rational mind pushed me forward. It's just someone out for a late hike, I told myself. People carry lanterns all the time. The deeper I went, the more the forest seemed to change. My boots sank into loam that felt strangely soft, like wet ash. The air cooled sharply, and a strange metallic tang coated my tongue. The light kept its distance, always just far enough ahead that I couldn't see who held it. I began to notice a rhythm in its swaying, almost like a heartbeat, steady, pulsing, alive. The hairs on my arms rose, though there was no wind. I paused to rest against a tree, breathing hard, and that's when I realized something was terribly wrong. The glow wasn't illuminating the ground around it. The trees, the brush, even the fog, it all remained dark, as though the light belonged to another world entirely. My breath caught, and for the first time, a sliver of old childhood fear crept in. Memories of campfire tales bubbled up, stories of a figure called the Lantern Man, told by locals in hushed voices. He was said to wander these woods, luring travelers deeper and deeper, until they vanished without a trace. I had laughed at those stories, chalking them up to folklore meant to scare tourists. But now, alone and surrounded by shadows, I felt the weight of those warnings. The glow paused too, as if sensing my hesitation, then drifted backward like it was beckoning me to follow. I whispered to myself, this isn't real. It's just some trick of light, but even my voice sounded uncertain. When I finally turned back toward camp, the forest behind me had changed. Paths I thought I'd memorized twisted in unfamiliar directions, and every landmark seemed to have shifted. My pulse hammered as I stumbled back through the dark, the glow following at a measured pace. By the time I reached my tent, night had fully descended. I thought it would stop there, retreating into the forest, but it didn't. The light circled my camp slowly, tracing a perfect ring just beyond the fire's reach. Then it did something that froze me in place. It began to mimic my movements. When I took a step left, it swayed left. When I crouched, it dimmed low like a bowing figure. It was no longer a wandering light. It was watching me, learning me. And then, with a sharp, almost playful flicker, it went out, plunging me into utter, suffocating blackness. The blackness wrapped around me like wet felt, swallowing even the outline of my hands. And for a moment, I couldn't tell whether my eyes were open. I thumbed the lighter. The wheel scraped, sparked, then died, a moth of heat collapsing in my palm. My breath sounded too loud, a saw-biting knotty wood. I said my name into the dark the way a diver tests depth, and the night gave nothing back. Then a glow budded 5 yards out, small as an ember, steady as a held note, hovering at the height of my eyes. It pulsed once, twice, like a ghostly heartbeat easing closer with my breath. I lifted my palm. The light lifted too, as if invisible fingers were tracing my gesture in reverse. The fire pit's ash carried the faint mineral tang of rain. The needles around my tent clicked softly, tiny bones in a box. I told myself that if it was learning me, then I could learn it. The thought steadied my spine like a splint. Knowledge is a rope thrown across a chasm. Belief is the hand that dares to grab it. I clipped my headlamp to a branch and tilted the reflector to draw faint planes of light. A poor man's lab in a ring of trees. In controlled experiments, mimicry reveals mechanism. I folded left. The glow drifted left. I pivoted, crouched, rose. It answered without delay, an echo that refused to travel. But what shouldn't have happened, happened. When I froze, it kept circling until it paused behind me where my shadow should have been, like a lantern wearing my absence. The forest listened, a cathedral with no congregation. Folklore said the Lantern Man lured followers, but hunger has many disguises. I spoke softly about St. Elmo's fire and piezoelectric sparks, about retinal ghosts and bioluminescent ponds in places where ores leave comets. Naming things calmed the trembling animal in my chest. The glow brightened as if language were calories. Awe and dread braided like a double helix inside my ribs, equal strands arguing. I remembered learning the constellations at 12, my father calling the sky a patient clock. Grief moved through me like cold current, sharpening everything. 3 brisk pulses, a pause, 3 more. Rhythm grained like wood. Morse came to mind, then biosonar. I clapped once. The glow flared, a needle of white that stitched my pupils and left a green afterimage. With a charcoal nub, I drew dot-dash clusters in the dust like planted seeds. The glow hovered above the marks and settled into a cadence that matched my heartbeat. The forest felt suddenly interior, a ribcage of pines. The light, a pulse threading arteries in the dark. I stepped beyond the ring, and it retreated, teasing me toward the ridge I'd crossed at dusk. We moved together, 2 needles tracing the same groove, the night our vinyl. A scent of iron rose, faint as blood on a bitten lip. I thought of travelers tugged off cliffs by will-o-wisps, of gases lifting from peat, of trickster myths that survive because something keeps proving them. I stopped, planted my heels, and named the nearest landmarks aloud, pinning myself to the map like bright tacks. The glow dimmed, then split like a seed. 2 halves slid apart and circled me, their weight combing the grass with a cold draft. I stepped through the gap, and both lights braided behind me for a breath, a luminous splice that suggested a figure walking in my silhouette. Heat rose to my cheeks, shame and wonder sharing air. I pivoted hard. The halves fused with a soft metallic pop and drifted to hover inches from my sternum. My pulse hitched, then synchronized. The darker kernel at the center spun like a pupil deciding whether to open. The lantern swelled, painting everything bone blue, and, with the calm certainty of a hand extinguishing a candle, it blinked out, and the dark fell like a curtain mid-sentence. The forest had been thinning for hours when I stumbled into a strange, circular clearing, as though the trees had agreed to give something in the center a wide berth. Sunlight dripped through the canopy in fractured streams, glinting off moss-slick stones like the shards of a broken mirror. And there it was, the tree. It rose higher than any pine I'd seen, a monolith of gnarled wood, its trunk swollen and warped like a scar that had never healed. The base was so wide I could have pitched my entire tent inside it, but what froze me wasn't its size. It was the hollow, yawning mouth at its center, a dark opening that seemed to inhale the light around it. Carvings crawled up the bark like a language I didn't want to understand. Some figures were human, bent and kneeling, while others were elongated, animal-like, with limbs bent at impossible angles. The grooves were deep, fresh enough that splinters still curled outward as though the tree had been wounded recently. When I brushed my fingers over one figure, I felt a heat beneath the bark, faint and pulsing, like a heartbeat hiding under layers of skin. Curiosity pulled at me like a tide. I stepped closer, ducking beneath the arch of the opening. The air inside was cooler, damp and heavy with the scent of rot and something metallic, like rusted iron. My footsteps echoed strangely, the sound hollow and disjointed, as though I were walking inside the chest cavity of something vast and sleeping. My headlamp cut through the dark and revealed scattered remnants littering the wooden floor. A torn hiking boot, a shredded map, a cracked water bottle. Items too modern to belong here and too personal to have been left behind willingly. My breath quickened. These weren't just lost belongings. They were the last traces of someone who had disappeared. I thought of the flyers I'd seen tacked to ranger stations, names paired with grainy photos, families still waiting for answers. My mind raced, rationalizing. Maybe this was just where animals dragged scavenged gear. But then I saw the initials carved into the side of a compass, the edges worn smooth by years of someone's hands. That's when the first sound reached me. It was a hum, low and resonant, like the vibration of a plucked cello string. At first I thought it came from the hollow itself, but as I turned, the pitch shifted, moving beneath my feet. The wood seemed to vibrate subtly, a living thing reacting to my presence. I staggered backward, suddenly desperate for open air. As I crossed the threshold, the hollow's entrance began to narrow, not with falling debris, but as if the tree itself were closing. Bark slid and twisted, knitting together with a sickening creak. In seconds, the opening was gone, replaced by seamless wood as if it had never existed. My lungs seized with panic. Behind me, the clearing was eerily silent, yet the hum continued, deeper now, coming not from the tree but from the earth itself. I dropped to my knees, Pressing my ear to the moss, the sound was unmistakable. Whatever was beneath me wasn't just moving, it was singing. And it was getting louder. The humming grew so deep it felt like it was vibrating my teeth. I scrambled backward on my hands, the moss cold and slick beneath my palms, my pulse roaring in my ears. It wasn't just a sound now, it was a presence, vast and ancient, pushing upward through the earth like some buried heart awakening. The clearing seemed to tremble with each pulse, subtle at first, then more violent, until the surrounding pines rattled like bones in a shaken box. The air thickened, heavy with the smell of damp soil and something older, something sour and metallic, like blood left to rust. Instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt anchored. I glanced at the tree, its seamless trunk now impossibly still as though mocking me. My mind conjured images of those carvings, the kneeling human figures, the monstrous silhouettes, and I realized they weren't just decorations. They were warnings, etched into the bark like a chronicle of past sacrifices. This wasn't just a hollow tree. It was a doorway, a throat-swallowing secret's hole, its rings like memories etched in wood, keeping record of everything it had consumed. Then the ground beneath me shifted. A hairline crack split the moss, releasing a puff of warm, foul air. The humming intensified into a low, guttural moan that seemed to rise from the very bedrock. My breath caught as a second crack formed, then a third, creating a jagged circle around the base of the tree. The forest floor was opening like a mouth. Somewhere deep inside that darkness, something stirred, its movements rhythmic and deliberate, like the slow stretch of a creature shaking off centuries of slumber. I stumbled to my feet, heart pounding. My flashlight beam wavered wildly as I scanned for a path out. That's when I saw them, half buried in the moss along the edge of the clearing. A line of hiking packs, faded and mold-eaten, arranged neatly like offerings. The nearest pack had a name stitched into the fabric, a name I recognized from a missing person flyer pinned at a trailhead weeks earlier. My stomach dropped. These people hadn't just disappeared, they'd been taken. The cracks widened and a thin, luminous mist began to seep out, glowing faintly like phosphorus. It swirled around my ankles, clinging with a strange, static-like buzz. My skin prickled where it touched, and for a brief, horrifying moment, I saw shapes moving inside the mist. Faces twisted in silent screams, arms reaching upward before dissolving into vapor. The humming became a chorus now, 1,000 overlapping voices harmonizing in a language I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't random. It was a song, and I was standing inside the first verse. I bolted toward the tree line, every step sinking slightly as the ground seemed to ripple beneath me. The mist chased me, clinging like cobwebs, pulling at my clothes, whispering in voices that weren't quite sound. Behind me, the tree shuddered violently, and with a deafening crack, part of its trunk split open. For a heartbeat, I saw something inside, a glistening, sinewy mass coiled like roots given flesh, eyes blinking open in the dark. I didn't dare look back again. As I stumbled into the dense forest, the humming shifted once more, dropping into a deep, resonant note that rattled my ribs. It wasn't anger. It was acknowledgement. I was no longer an intruder. I was a witness. And as the sound faded into the distance, a terrible realization settled over me. The singing hadn't been coming from beneath just this clearing. It was everywhere, woven through the very earth itself, a song too vast for one mind to hold. The forest wasn't just alive, it was awake, and now it knew my name. The first night alone in the backcountry always feels like a test. By day, the forest is open and honest, its sunlight spilling like gold over the moss and fallen logs. But when darkness comes, the trees seem to lean inward, their branches knitting into a cage that swallows sound. My small orange tent glowed faintly against that wall of blackness, a fragile bubble of warmth in an ocean of cold. I had hiked miles to reach this remote ridge, chasing solitude, but as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring at the nylon ceiling, solitude began to feel like abandonment. At first, the noise was subtle, just a faint crunch of leaves, so delicate it could have been my imagination. But then it came again, sharper, deliberate. Footsteps. They circled once, twice, tracing a slow orbit around my tent. I froze, my breath caught high in my throat. Fear is a predator. It circles in silence, waiting for the moment you dare to breathe. I dared not move. The steps stopped just beside my head. The thin fabric of the tent blurred the shape outside into something abstract, grotesque. a massive, distorted shadow stretched across the mesh window. It was upright, vaguely human, but its proportions were wrong. The limbs too long, the head tilted at an unnatural angle, like a marionette held by invisible strings. My heart pounded so loudly I was certain it would give me away. The shadow shifted, stooping low as if peering inside. My rational mind fought for dominance. A bear standing, a trick of light, a nightmare bleeding into wakefulness. But deep inside, some ancient part of me knew better. This was no animal I could name. This was something older, something that thrived in the spaces where logic falters. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. With trembling hands, I reached for the zipper and yanked it open, ready to confront whatever nightmare waited outside. Cold air knifed into the tent. My headlamp's beam cut through the darkness, stark and bright. There was nothing there, only the empty forest, silent and still. The trees stood like sentinels, innocent and mute. I spun in a slow circle, my light catching nothing but mist. My tent behind me looked pitifully small, a toy abandoned in the vast wilderness. I stayed awake until dawn, every muscle tense, listening for the return of those footsteps. None came. When the first weak light of morning spilled through the trees, I stumbled outside, exhausted but alive. That's when I saw them. 4 deep gouges carved into the nearest pine, each mark spaced impossibly far apart, higher than I could reach even standing on my shoulders. Sap oozed slowly from the wounds, glinting like amber tears. My stomach turned. Whatever had circled me wasn't bound by the rules of the creatures I knew. As I backed away, the forest fell unnaturally silent, as though holding its breath. Then, from deep within the trees, I heard a voice, my own voice, calling my name with perfect clarity. It wasn't an echo, it was an invitation. My blood iced over as the sound threaded through the trees, too precise to be a trick of echoes. It wasn't just my voice, it was me, every inflection, every breath. The uncanny mimicry cracked something deep inside, a primal alarm older than language itself. I wanted to run, but terror rooted me in place, my boots sinking slightly into the damp forest floor, as if the earth itself were clutching at my ankles. Slowly, I turned toward the direction the voice had come from. A narrow game trail cut between the pines, swallowed in shadows even though dawn light should have reached it. My name floated out again, softer this time, coaxing. It was the way someone might call a pet, not a person. My throat tightened. The rational part of me begged for restraint. But curiosity and fear are twins. They pull you toward the flame even as you know you'll be burned. I moved forward, one step at a time, scanning the ground for tracks. Nothing. The soil was undisturbed, as if no living thing had passed this way for centuries. The silence deepened the farther I went, a silence so thick it felt physical, pressing against my eardrums. Even my heartbeat seemed muted, like the forest was swallowing it whole. The trail ended at a small glade ringed by ancient pines. Their trunks were marked with the same claw gouges I had seen earlier, dozens of them, spiraling upward as if something had climbed and leapt between trees. I tilted my head back, following the marks until they vanished into the canopy. That's when I saw it, or rather, didn't see it. Between 2 branches, the light shifted wrong, like heat haze over asphalt. It was as though something massive was there, cloaked perfectly, bending the world around it. My breath hitched. The thing moved, and the distortion flowed with it, revealing fleeting impressions, a limb too long, a head cocked at a predatory angle. Then came the sound, my voice again from above. "Over here," it called sweetly. The words stretched into a near laugh. I stumbled back, the motion breaking the forest's uncanny stillness. The creature, or whatever it was, descended silently, the air trembling in its wake. I didn't wait to see its shape fully revealed. I bolted, crashing through underbrush, branches whipping my face, lungs burning. Behind me there was no pursuit I could hear, but the absence of sound was worse. Fear isn't always a roar. Sometimes it's the vacuum left behind when the predator chooses not to chase, yet. When I finally reached my campsite, the tent lay flattened, shredded into ribbons. My pack was gone, but my sleeping bag sat upright in the dirt, arranged like a decoy body. My knees gave out. This wasn't random violence. It was a message. Then, from the tree line behind me, my voice rang out once more, calm, almost conversational. "Why are you running?" The question echoed inside my skull as the forest seemed to lean closer. and I realized with chilling clarity that whatever had circled my tent last night hadn't just learned my voice. It had learned me. The cabin should have been dead, yet something inside it was breathing. I felt it before I saw it. The faint tremor in the boards, a furtive pulse hiding under dust. The door resisted like a memory that didn't want to be retrieved, then sighed and sent moths drifting from the rafters. My beam carved a ribbon of light across a room collapsed by time, maps peeling from the walls, a cot sagging like a broken rib, coffee cups furred with mold. On the desk, a lunchbox radio glowed weak green, as though remembering the hand that last touched it. I told myself it was a trick. The power lines out here were severed years ago, and my phone had surrendered to red bars long before noon. Still the radio hummed, a low animal in the corner. Static washed the air like rain on tin, softening every edge. Then a voice threaded through the snow, thin as old tape. A woman reciting coordinates between trembling breaths. Her name matched one I knew from a trailhead flyer, its paper curled to parchment by weather and waiting. The room tightened around me, as if listening too. The radio became a haunted diary, each static-laced word another page of the dead screaming to be read. I eased the gain and the noise thinned to a corridor. A young man spoke of a ridge corkscrewing into cloud, the wind at his back like hands urging him on. His syllables faltered mid-sentence, and in the gap I heard the forest itself, needles whispering like matched teeth. I wrote his coordinates in dust with my finger, though I had no plan to follow them anywhere except inward, toward understanding. But what if understanding isn't a lantern? What if it is bait? Hunger and caution sparred in my chest. A Polaroid lay half buried under soot. 4 hikers grinning, the paper creased along their smiles like a map folded too often. Someone had underlined a date with a pen that must have bled its last drop right here. I reached for tidy explanations. Relay tests, pranksters with clippings, a bored ham bouncing ghosts off the ionosphere. Yet the cabin sat miles beyond any honest signal, and these voices carried the exhaustion of years, syllables worn smooth like river stones. The diary kept turning pages without my permission. The next transmission arrived without prelude. A child counted softly, as if timing footfalls. 4, 5, 6. Behind the numbers, water moved over stone. My scalp tightened. Bulletins rarely include children. They become something else before paperwork catches them. I clung to procedure like a rope in a flood, maybe a looped drill, a ranger's training tape, a morbid archive. Then the counting stopped, and a whisper asked for a flashlight that wasn't there, as politely as if I might hand it through the speaker cloth. Wind should have curled through the cracked panes. Instead, warmth pressed my back, as though someone leaned close to see what I would do next. I turned the dial and brushed past a choir of faraway storms until a woman sobbed apologies to no one I could name. Another voice offered a landmark, the old switchback where the signage used to be, and then unmade itself in a long, rattling breath. I leaned in until my breath fogged the faceplate. Static narrowed. Footsteps seemed to walk the corridor toward me. A shape of sound assembled, familiar as the lines of my own palm. My voice arrived, thinner, urgent, certain, saying my name once, then again, and issuing a single command that cracked bright as a struck match, small and absolute. Leave. It wore my vowels like borrowed clothes, yet fit better than anything my throat could sew. The radio's green eye fluttered. The needle quivered toward a frequency not printed on the dial. Floorboards tightened under my heels, timber bracing before a blow. I reached for method like a drowning swimmer grabs driftwood. Change one variable, observe the effect. That thought steadied my wrist. I turned the volume to 0. The air quieted, but in bones the voice spoke, a pressure you cannot plug with fingers. Static combed my skin like nettles, and the cabin leaned inward, a crow eyeing shiny. I slid the backplate off and found no batteries, only cedar needles crisp as correspondence. The set kept humming anyway, a heart freed from ribs. Refusing to be audience, I lashed the case and slipped it into my pack, zipping the teeth like sealing a mouth. Outside, afternoon wore pewter. Wind pressed the clearing flat. The pines held their breath like a jury. From the pack, voices leaked tinny, as if a wall learned to remember. I promised to carry them to ground where reception might make sense. Saying it made me ridiculous and responsible. The trail took weight with a crunch. The cabin closed behind me like a book. The path climbed in switchbacks, frost glittering like ground glass. Midway up, the transmissions changed tense. They stopped pleading and began narrating. My route, my stumbles, the prickle at my neck when a raven crossed my shadow. The words arrived seconds ahead, captions for a film I hadn't reached. "Don't look left," a man advised. Reflex as a compass, I looked. A ravine opened like a slit pupil. On an alder braid, a scrap of nylon fluttered, vanishing as the wind exhaled. The voices named breath I drew, the slip before my boot slid. But what they didn't expect was my refusal to hurry. I matched their tempo and kept climbing. At the ridge, wind unspooled in ribbons and snow began to fall, slow, counted. I set the radio on granite and ringed it with fieldstones, a poor man's Faraday chapel. Penlight off, I listened with everything else. The diary thinned to a lane. A ranger recited the phonetic alphabet until letters turned to breath. A teenager mumbled coordinates and said he was tired of being brave. Then the channel cleared like a pond after a thrown stone. My voice returned, older by hours. It gave details I had not lived. Stone circle, snow thickening, lightning crawling the ridge without thunder. It said a choice was coming, and I would hate it. You said lightning would arrive like a vein, bright and silent, and give me one chance. Leave the radio here and walk away empty, or shoulder it and let the lost follow in my shadow. The wind ratcheted tight. Snow thickened into ash. Fear is a tide. It recedes to show what anchors you. I touched the set. It was warm as a wrist. A filament stitched the sky. Voices hushed, as if a hand closed every mouth. In the pause, I heard sound under the static, a heartbeat that might be mountain or me. I lifted pack straps, choosing, and asked the ridge a question it might answer with light. The ravine announced itself by temperature before I saw it. One moment the trail was honest with sun. The next, a breath like cellar air slid across my cheeks and turned the ferns darker. I pushed through alder, and the forest opened on a gash where mist pooled like milk. A wooden bridge spanned it, narrow as a hallway, ribbed with silvered planks, too old to stand and yet intact. A sketch someone refused to erase. I narrate danger to calm myself, so I listed the facts. Cedar uprights hand-hewn, rope rails tarred and friable, a span bowed with a tired spine, wrong for this region where steel does the work. It felt like the past had slipped its leash. Curiosity tugged like a dog on mine. The ravine exhaled again, damp, mineral, and I set one foot on the first plank. It answered with a groan, a cello string tuned down. My weight settled. The boards trembled but held. I moved slowly, palm on the rope, counting. 10 paces, 20. Midway, mist climbed to my knees and curled around my thighs like a river remembering an older course. The far side stayed a pale suggestion. The bridge felt like a sentence diagrammed in air, subject and object straining to meet. I looked down. The ravine wasn't a floor, a moving fabric of cloud, unthreaded and reknotted by wind that never touched the trees. For a second I imagined outlines, shoulders turning, a profile rising before smoothing flat. My voice went small. What I didn't expect was the faint scorch of letters on a plank near my boot. Initials with a year older than my parents. I took a photo, then another, bracketing exposure, trusting the lens the way some people trust prayer. The screen showed only fog, each frame a gray square as featureless as a cataracted eye. I felt the double sensation of standing on something that refused to be seen. The bridge was a fragile thread between worlds, unraveling the moment I looked too closely. I pocketed the phone. Seeing wasn't helping. Feeling might. On the far bank, the forest looked a shade different, as if the green had learned a secret. Moss glowed faintly, and bark held more shadow than seemed possible. I touched the last post, knocking on wood, and the mist eddied in slow rings. For no reason I can defend, I whispered that I was only visiting. The wind paused. A jay fell silent. Back in town, when I mentioned the bridge, the locals smiled the way you humor a tourist who misread a map. "No bridge up there," they said in chorus. Two agreed to hike out at first light, more to prove a point than follow a mystery. We reached the ravine by noon. The air turned cellar cold. The ferns darkened obediently. But the span was gone. No ropes, no planks, no posts. Only mist pluming from the cut like breath on winter glass. I stood where I'd placed my first step and raised the phone. Fog again, a blank refusal. My companions traded the patient look of people deciding how kind to be. I walked to the lip. pebbles ticked into the white below. Then the mist rippled like a muscle tightening, and a single wet footprint appeared at the edge of the ravine. Right there, it wasn't mine. The toes splayed wide, the arch longer than a human's. Yet the heel showed a familiar divot. Water pooled inside the print as if just lifted from a river. My companion said nothing, their silence a tarp. The tug returned, the mix of dread and curiosity that pulls sailors toward sirens. I eased a hand into the mist. It cooled my skin the way a basement swallows summer, and the footprint darkened, as if noticing me. I slid a trekking pole into the gap where the first plank should be. The fog accepted it, then ate half its length until the shaft looked sawn by vapor. When I dragged it back, the carbon was beaded with dew and smelled faintly of iron. The bridge was a rumor of structure, scaffolding sketched in breath. Then the footprint bled at the edges, ink wicking outward. Another print appeared beside it, angled toward the trees as though turning to listen. The men chose town over wonder, promising rope and sense. I stayed because leaving felt like erasing a sentence mid-verb. Alone, I paced the rim, speaking measurements into my phone's recorder, as though data could anchor a ghost. The ravine breathed in and out. On the opposite bank, a fainter print formed, pointed toward a narrow path, a game trail lit as if the moss had stored daylight. The world felt hinge-loose like a door lifted off one pin. I tested the lip with my weight, not stepping, just leaning. The mist buckled, then held, the way spring ice sometimes does for fools. Fear braided with awe. Together they made a rope I could both climb and hang from. I recalled papers about optical cloaks and refractive gradients, about sound mapping empty spaces. Science is a lantern. Belief is the oil inside. The print ahead deepened, inviting. A jay called once, then swallowed its echo like a magician palming a coin. I called hello because loneliness is a muscle, and mine was cramping. The mist stirred as though a chest had filled, and frost feathered across the rim in delicate ribs. I fired a burst of shots. Every frame checked to fog, then one image resolved, not the span, but of my own back from a height I couldn't reach. A trick, a glitch, a warning. The print at my boots brightened with sheen, and ripples chased one another like minnows under glass. Across the cut, the forest sharpened, edges gaining a painter's patience. I thought of the locals' certainty, of maps that lie by omission. Maybe the bridge kept a tide table of days, visible only when pressure and memory aligned. I set the pole forward again. Leaves clicked behind me, the polite teeth of someone deciding whether to speak. I stood at the lip, heat on my face, cold on my shins, air thickening like syrup. Then came the footstep behind me, wet and careful. Another. The ravine listened without offering advice. I didn't turn. The mist in front of me dimpled, offering a shallow cup, as if a palm had risen from below to receive mine. Threads are strongest when pulled from both ends. I breathed once, counted 3, and lowered my hand toward the waiting hollow, wondering which side would claim my weight when something finally closed the herd of unseen giants, shaking the mountains with a rumble that rattled the glass in my cabin windows. I'd grown used to the lonely rhythm of this stretch of wilderness, where nights were marked only by the sigh of wind through pine needles and the occasional call of an owl. That's why the flash of light caught me so violently off guard. Through sheets of rain, high on a distant ridge, the old fire watchtower blazed to life, a white, pulsing beacon slicing the darkness. For years, that tower had been nothing but a relic. It hadn't been manned since a wildfire gutted half the valley decades ago. I'd hiked past it plenty of times, its wooden legs warped, its observation deck weather-beaten, windows boarded over. It was a monument to disuse, a skeleton leaning against the sky. But now, as lightning danced across the clouds, the beacon glared defiantly through the storm like an eye that had just opened. My pulse quickened with something more than curiosity. I grabbed my pack and set out into the downpour. The trail up the ridge twisted through blackened trees, their charred trunks slick and shining. Rain stung my skin and hissed against rocks, masking the small sounds that usually kept me company. The higher I climbed, the more oppressive the silence felt, broken only by the wind keening through dead branches. My flashlight cut a narrow cone through the mist, and for a while, I couldn't tell if the rhythmic flash above me was guiding me or warning me away. By the time I reached the base of the tower, the storm had softened to a steady drizzle. I craned my neck upward, my breath catching. The structure loomed against the night like a shipwrecked mast, its beacon casting a cold glow that barely reached the trees below. The tower stood like a lighthouse in a sea of darkness, its warning light lost to the waves of time. The steps creaked beneath my boots as I ascended, each groan of wood magnified by the emptiness surrounding me. At the top, I hesitated before opening the door. My gut told me I wasn't alone, but when I pushed inside, the room was empty. Empty, but not untouched. A half-empty thermos sat on a table, still warm when I wrapped my hands around it. A pair of binoculars lay beside a map marked with crude circles and hastily scrawled notes. Movement near northern tree line. Unknown tracks. Stay inside after dark. Then I saw the journal. Its pages were warped from moisture, the handwriting uneven, as though the author's hands had been shaking. As I read, my chest tightened. The entries spoke of creatures in the tree line, described in fragmented sentences and broken thoughts. Something was watching the tower, waiting for the moment a human silhouette appeared in the window. The last sentence ended mid-word, the pen stroke trailing off like a snapped branch. A sudden flicker from the beacon drew my gaze to the window. Down below, at the edge of the clearing, 2 pinpoints of pale light glowed among the trees. Eyes, unblinking, staring directly at me. The eyes did not blink, not even when the beacon swept over them like a lighthouse beam dragging across masts. They hovered at a height suggesting something upright, but the space between them felt wrong, too far apart, like 2 coins pressed on a skull that never learned our geometry. I told myself they might be retro-reflective patches on a deer, tapetum lucidum throwing back the tower's glare. But deer don't hold still that long, and no deer I knew watched with the composure of a surveyor measuring me for the ground. I killed the flashlight to let my eyes settle and listened. Rain patted the roof in a patient metronome. Wind combed the canopy until it sounded like breath through reeds. On the desk, the thermos's metal ticked as it cooled, domestic as a kitchen, and that ordinary sound steadied me. Fear is a river. If you stand in it without bracing, it carries you where it wants. I braced. I checked the generator cabinet out of habit and found a rusted pull cord and a mouse nest feathered with paper strips. Yet the beacon continued, pulsing at intervals too clean to be accident. Some storms charge lines, I reasoned, and old circuits sometimes remember. But what if remembering wasn't mechanical? What if the tower, once a sentinel, was relighting itself because something had tripped its ancient reflex? To warn. I returned to the window. The eyes had multiplied. 4 now. No, 6 stepped along the tree line like pricked holes in velvet. They arranged themselves in a crescent, crossing not into the open, as if the clearing were a moat they refused to touch. The journal's warnings crowded my head, each sentence a hook. I raised the binoculars and saw not irises but pale ovals of glow, halos with darkness at the center, the way coals look when they're pretending to be asleep. A scrape trembled up the stairs, light, deliberate against wood, then fell quiet. I swallowed and set my back to the door, counting the boards between us like rosary beads. A part of me that still believed in protocols took over. Barriers, signals, exits. I laid the flare on the sill, checked the storm radio, marked bearings on the map. My hands moved with the calm of someone teaching a frightened child to breathe. And the frightened child was me, outside. The beacon hit the tree line and every pair of eyes closed. Together. Perfectly choreographed, only to reopen after the sweep had passed. The synchronization rattled me more than any scream. Intelligence announces itself in patterns the way birds announce spring. If they were hunting, they were also counting. I forced myself to think in clean lines. Angles of approach, distance to ladder, the time it would take to reach the ground if I jumped and trusted my knees. I cracked the flare and the tower filled with arterial red. The eyes dimmed, then lifted higher, as though whatever carried them had straightened. A sound rose from the tree line, woodpecker quick but deeper, clicks cascading like castanets in a throat. The hairs along my arms stood in chorus. I set the flare on the outside catwalk and watched it spit, a meteor caged to steel. Smoke tugged sideways, and in the drift I thought I saw outlines bending the rain, like heat above a road. The journal lay open where I'd left it. The last entry, a half-born word with so much pressure behind it, the pen had torn the page. I pressed my palm to the paper and asked the room, quietly, what the writer had tried to finish. The beacon staggered once, twice, then steadied. Below, two eyes detached from the crescent and moved into the clearing, deliberate as chess. They stopped at the ladder's foot and lifted until they were level with my gaze, though nothing climbed. Wind pushed a sheet of rain across the deck, and in that curtain I finally glimpsed height, something tall enough to meet me without stairs, its edges folding the storm like origami taught by a cruel teacher. The flare guttered, spitting red confetti that drifted into the dark. My hand found the radio's transmit and pressed. Static answered. Then a voice I recognized as my own asked if I was ready to be relieved. The eyes brightened, tender as mercy. Somewhere below, a boot stepped onto the first rung. Mine, or someone wearing my weight? The forest floor had always felt solid beneath my boots, a dependable map of roots and soil. That illusion shattered when I stumbled upon the fissure. It was hidden beneath a thicket of tangled roots, their shapes knotted like arthritic fingers clutching at secrets. A cool draft leaked upward through the narrow opening, carrying with it a smell of rust and wet stone. I crouched low, brushing aside leaves and dirt, revealing a jagged crevice just wide enough to slip through. Curiosity gnawed at me like a persistent insect. This part of the forest wasn't on any map I'd studied, yet the air rising from below carried a rhythm, almost a pulse. Against every instinct urging me back to daylight, I slid feet first into the opening. My boots scraped rock, then dropped into blackness. The narrow shaft delivered me into a tunnel so dark my headlamp felt like a dying star. The walls closed in, damp and rough, etched with strange markings. They weren't natural, lines and curves intersecting like some ancient script coded into the stone. When I ran my fingers over them, they felt warm, as if the rock had been breathing. I moved forward carefully, each step stirring up the smell of decay. The sound of dripping water echoed endlessly, though I couldn't see any source. Then my beam caught something pale against the earth. Bones, scattered, broken, and old. Some were small, like the fragile ribs of animals, but others were unmistakably human. A jawbone lay half-buried in silt, teeth bared in a silent scream. My breath hitched and I stumbled back, boot striking another skull. I wanted to believe these were relics of some long-forgotten tragedy, victims of time. But the clean edges of the bones told another story, something recent, something hungry. The tunnel branched ahead, veins splitting off in all directions, pulsing with a darkness older than humanity. I knelt, shining my light along the walls. The markings here were different, sharper, more frantic. They told a story I couldn't read, but I felt it. The frantic energy of prey scratching messages no one would ever understand. A faint sound drifted through the passages. A dragging, rhythmic and wet, like something heavy being hauled across stone. It came closer, then faded, then closer again, as though the tunnels themselves were breathing. My mouth went dry. I switched off my headlamp and crouched low, swallowed by darkness. The sound continued, now accompanied by a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the walls. I realized with cold clarity that I wasn't exploring abandoned tunnels. These passages were active. Something lived here, something that fed. The bones weren't remnants of the past, they were warnings for the future. My headlamp flickered back on just long enough to illuminate a series of fresh grooves in the dirt, claw-like trenches leading toward me. I stumbled backward, panic unraveling every ounce of reason. My boot caught on a root and I fell hard. Before I could scramble up, a hand, human or not, shot out from the darkness and clamped around my ankle, its grip cold and impossibly strong. It yanked once, and the world reduced to grit and pain. My back hit stone. Pebbles skittered like startled insects. Instinct outran thought. I twisted, stamped hard, and the grip slipped as if tendons unspooled beneath my boot. I scrambled to my knees, lamp swinging a feverish pendulum that stitched light across wet walls. The hand withdrew into the floor of shadow, not retreating so much as sinking, like something submerging through night water. The hum deepened. A second note joined it, and the tunnel felt suddenly arterial, as if I were trespassing inside a throat that wanted to swallow without chewing. I forced breath into counts. 4 in, 4 held, 4 out. Panic is a solvent. It strips the mind to noise. I needed edges. The carvings offered them. One series repeated in tight chevrons, arrows pointing toward a side passage. I chose the arrows because choice itself felt like scaffolding. The branch narrowed, then opened into a chamber ribbed with roots. They arched overhead like an inverted hull, slick and glistening, dripping threads that beaded on my jacket like cold sweat. Bones lay here too, but arranged, not random. Rings within rings. Vertebrae set like prayer beads circling a shallow pit. Someone had sorted them with a patience that felt more insect than human. In the pit, my light found a bundle, a rotted pack, a jacket, a laminated card with a faded face. The name tugged at memory from a ranger board, a family name once taped beside a phone number. Awe and grief braided into a rope I both climbed and burned my hands on. Before I could touch it, the bones clicked, small impacts like teeth testing a bite. The hum rose, punctuated by delicate ticks that skittered along the root ribs, and the floor lifted in slow blisters where something pressed from underneath. Tasting the room with pressure, I whispered I would leave. A foolish treaty offered to an old country. The clicking paused, listening, then resumed closer, under my left palm. Heat collected through the ground, a fever brewing inside earth. The tunnels are veins, I thought, and I am a clot. But what they didn't expect was my refusal to freeze. I backed toward a seam where two walls met, keeping the pit caged in the corner of my eye. Chevrons bent upward toward a crack narrow as a letter slit. Air pulled through in steady drafts, cold as cellar lungs. I shouldered my pack, wedged my ribs, and exhaled until bone complained. Stone rasped. The slit widened a breath. Behind me, the dragging began again, accompanied by a sound like wet rope hauled over rock. It was close enough to hear pauses for breath. I pushed into the seam. The rock answered with a thin scream and conceded a hand's width. Root threads snapped against my cheeks like violin strings. Childhood evenings surfaced, me on a roof naming constellations to cheat fear into behaving. I named these vein, rib, throat, mouth. The hum gathered into a single syllable without language, the way thunder assembles before it chooses a word. Cold air sharpened. I angled my hips, hauled, and burst into a horizontal chute that pitched me forward. I slid on elbows, granite sanding my sleeves, lamp jittering stars. The chute delivered me to a ledge above a black river moving slow as oil. On the far bank, a ladder of pale roots trailed like knuckles into the dark. Between me and exit, the water heaved and something pale turned in its skin, an eye without lid, milk blue and wide. I tracked the current and spotted an arch where night pooled thinner. If I could cross, daylight lived beyond it. The draft tasted like rain and pine. My belly crawled. The eye sank. The hum dimmed, then rose behind me, closer than footsteps. I didn't look. Looking makes shapes permanent. I counted 3, braced, and jumped, catching the root ladder with both hands. Skin tore, bark burned. I climbed as the river convexed, shouldering itself toward the ledge with the patience of a tide. At the arch, the world thinned to gray. Wind spoke in actual words, leaves, not echoes. I hauled through, dirt cascading over my shoulders, and felt the tunnel try to keep me by the ankles with suction like mud at low tide. I kicked free, rolled into fernlight, and lay shaking while the hum withdrew below like a submarine losing depth. For a long beat, I heard only my heart rehearsing escape. Then the fronds parted behind me, and a hand, human or not, closed again around my ankle. I didn't notice the boundary until asphalt thinned the scent of pine, and the silhouettes of buildings lifted like ship hulls out of fog. Civilization greeted me with humming fluorescence, the peppery bite of diner coffee, and a window that reflected a stranger carrying a forest on his clothes. I kept thinking distance would braid my scattered hours into a rope I could hold. Instead, every mile felt like rain on chalk. Details ran, colors bled, edges softened. Memory is a fragile map, and the forest is the storm that washes it blank. What remained were islands that drifted when I tried to name them. I started with the bartender because his face looked like it believed people for a living. I laid out my route like trail markers, a hum under the earth, a light that learned me, a tower that relit itself in rain. Names, distances, bearings. But as I spoke, the markers slid. A creek grew into a ridge. The ridge folded into a road I could not place. I reached for specifics the way a drowning hand reaches for the rung and came up with water. He topped off my cup gently, the mercy you give a weather report. At the ranger station, a young officer opened a spiral notebook and asked me to trace the loop. The pencil felt too light, the map too clean. I drew 3 lines and realized I had lost the order of night and day. My photos were worse. Squares of fog, trees I didn't recognize, timestamps shuffled like cards cut by a nervous dealer. He suggested rest, the words sliding over me like a lid. Outside, the wind skated gravel in small, purposeful circles, as if rehearsing erasure. I tried rituals with handles: food, water, a shower, and a motel that smelled like old rain. The steam cleared the mirror, and for one steady minute, my life felt chronological. Then I opened my field notebook. I had filled pages in the woods, diagrams pressed so hard the pen bruised the paper. Now the margins were empty where sketches should have been, sentences clipped mid-thought, like stalks snipped and bundled elsewhere. The forest wasn't only behind me, it was upstream from me, redacting as I read. How do you argue with an editor that lives in the soil? I phoned Mara because she is unafraid of bad weather and people. Years ago, she taught me to steer by a cheap compass and a sky chart, patience cupped in her hands like a steady flame. She listened while I failed to pin the hours, then said trauma can shear memory clean. I told her this didn't feel like shearing. It felt like sanding, continuous, precise, leaving no splinters to catch on. Sleep, she said, and I agreed. But what I didn't expect was the way her name dimmed the second we hung up, like a porch light on a failing line. By evening, I walked without purpose, following the buried creek that now runs under grates and alleys. The sky pressed low, pewter-lidded. I bought new pens and a stiff paper map, tried to anchor the day with receipts and small obedience. Laundry coins counted twice, an apple cored to a clean star. Ordinary life should have moored me, yet every step loosened knots I couldn't retie. A gust curled down Main Street and turned me toward the grocery bulletin board. Flyers flapped like tired birds. Lost dogs, bake sale, trail advisory on neon paper. In the center, a blank rectangle waited, a nail already hammered. Maybe because blank spaces begged confession. The paper was thick, the kind used for notices that endure rain. A man with a sack of oranges brushed my shoulder and the hammered nail winked like a pupil catching light. I smoothed the empty sheet and felt a shiver run back through my arm, static traveling a wire to find the oldest wound. Across the glass, the diner's neon pulsed, a heartbeat recoloring the white. Anchor, I told myself. Name, date, coordinates. I wrote them in the corner with my new pen. The ink stuttered as if the nib had crossed a border I couldn't see. I spelled the town wrong, then corrected it into a town I didn't recognize. Memory is supposed to be a path you can walk twice. Mine had turned to river ice, slick and breaking where I placed my weight. I felt unmoored, like a signpost uprooted in flood. I needed witnesses. At the library, I asked to file a report. The archivist brought out topo maps and a plastic ruler, and together we arranged silhouettes of ridges like bones on a light table. Landmarks left my mouth with confidence that evaporated halfway across the sentence. She asked if I meant the North Fork trailhead or the spur by the tanks, but the names slid away like minnows. Maybe you should rest, she said gently. A kindness and a refusal. On the steps, I called Mara and left a message I didn't remember finishing. When I pressed play, I heard only wind. My words skimmed off like cream. Panic rose fast, bubbles breaking in a pot, and I did what I teach students not to do. I ran. Past the diner, past the barber with empty chairs, back to the board because absence had shape and I needed to see it. The center square was no longer blank. A new flyer had taken it. The photo was low contrast, the kind you get from a trail camera. The subject stood half-turned at the edge of pines, a backpack strap biting a shoulder I knew too well. The caption was simple: missing, last seen 2 days ago. If found, contact Ranger District. The name below it was mine. Laughter rose and died in my throat, a match starved by wind. A woman pushing a stroller paused, read, then glanced up at me and away, eyes doing the math people do when possibility unsettles the floor. I pressed my thumb to the paper. Ink did not come away. Instead, it moved into me, bleeding into my whirls like creek water and sand. The date stamp tripped the mind, posted 6 days from now. I backed into the street. Cars moved around me like patient fish. Evening thickened, not with storm, but with the kind of dusk that erases fences first. I tried to summon specifics as armor, the watchtower's bearing, the carved compass, the voice on the radio. But recollection bent like heat above asphalt. Behind me, leaves scratched a small grammar against brick, punctuation from an author I couldn't outrun. Somewhere near, breath warmed the shell of my ear, intimate as hands cupping water. The town thinned to silence. A whisper unstitched the last knot and tied another in its place. You never left. Subscribe, if you dare,